Walk down a crowded street anywhere in the world and count how many people you pass in 5 minutes. Now ask yourself an uncomfortable question. How many of them would help you if you collapsed right there on the sidewalk? Most of us assume the answer is, some of them, probably. And that assumption, that total strangers might act like they're on your side, is one of the strangest bets our species ever made. For almost all of human history, that bet would have sounded insane. Humans evolved living in small bands, usually somewhere between a few dozen and a couple hundred people, a scale some researchers link to the upper limit of how many stable relationships a human brain can comfortably track at once. Everyone knew everyone. You could trace exactly how you were related to the person sharing your fire, who owed who a favor, who could be trusted with the last of the winter stores. Strangers weren't neighbors. Strangers were, at best, a cautious meeting on a trail, and at worst a threat, because a person with no history attached to them was, by every instinct available at the time, a person with no reason to behave. So here's the actual mystery behind cities. It's not, how did humans learn to build big buildings? Humans are excellent at building things. The mystery is, how did humans convince their own brains built for small trusted groups, to tolerate living packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of people they will never personally know? Something had to change that wasn't architecture. Something had to change about what counted as safe to be near. Let's go back further than kings, further than crowns, further than palaces, to the actual invention underneath all of it, the city. Not the throne inside it, the crowd around the throne. For most of the deep past, big settlement and safe settlement pulled in opposite directions. More people in one place meant more mouths to feed, more waste to deal with, more disease, and more chances for a disagreement to turn violent. Small groups had an advantage. Everyone had a reputation, everyone had relationships, and bad behavior had consequences that were personal and immediate. Scale that up to thousands of residents, and suddenly most of the people around you are functionally invisible strangers. Reputation stops working when nobody recognizes your face. And yet, somewhere around 9,000 years ago, in what's now central Turkey, humans tried it anyway. The site is called Çatalhöyük, and it might be one of the strangest towns archaeology has ever dug up, because in a lot of ways, it doesn't look like a city is supposed to look at all. Picture a honeycomb instead of a town. Houses built wall to wall to wall, with no streets running between them. To get home, you didn't walk down a road and knock on a door. You climbed a ladder up onto the roof, walked across the tops of your neighbors' houses, and dropped down through a hole into your own home from above. At its peak, Çatalhöyük may have housed several thousand people, packed into this dense rooftop maze, generation after generation, for well over 1,000 years. Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. Archaeologists have found no obvious palace at Çatalhöyük, no throne room, no single monumental building clearly built to glorify one ruling family. Houses are packed with symbolism, bull skulls mounted on walls, elaborate burials beneath the floors, painted murals, but the symbolism is distributed almost everywhere, not concentrated in one official temple or one royal household. This looks less like a kingdom with a capital, and more like thousands of individual households, each quietly running their own version of the same rituals. Which raises a genuinely important point that a lot of the kings and thrones version of history skips right past. You do not necessarily need a king to build a city. You need something else first. You need thousands of strangers willing to live in uncomfortably close range of one another without it constantly ending in violence. And Çatalhöyük wasn't some isolated island either. Excavators have found obsidian at the site that was quarried from volcanoes hundreds of kilometers away, meaning these rooftop-dwelling farmers were already plugged into long-distance trade networks, stretching well beyond anything a single kin-based band could organize alone. Strangers weren't just tolerated inside the settlement. Strangers, somewhere out there on the trade routes, were already being quietly relied on too. Archaeologists working the site have also noticed something else. Certain houses were rebuilt on the exact same spot, floor after floor, generation after generation, far more elaborately decorated and far more densely packed with burials than their neighbors. Researchers sometimes call these history houses, ancestral anchor points that held a household's identity in place across centuries. That may be the closest thing Çatalhöyük had to public memory, not a king's name carved in stone, but a floor that quite literally remembered who had lived and died there. So how did Çatalhöyük manage that, without an obvious ruling class enforcing order from the top? Some archaeologists think the answer is that the household itself became the unit of order, not a king, not a central government, but a repeated pattern. Every home rebuilding its own shrine, replaying its own rituals, burying its own dead beneath its own floor, generation after generation, almost like thousands of small temples instead of one large one. Order wasn't imposed from above, it was copy-pasted sideways, house by house, using shared belief instead of a shared boss. It's a clever solution. It's also, it turns out, a solution with a ceiling. A city built this way can grow only so large before something breaks. There's no obvious mechanism for large-scale coordination, no central storage system managing food security for the whole settlement, no specialized administration tracking who owes what to whom. Everyone is doing a version of the same thing, which is remarkably stable and remarkably difficult to scale past a certain size. Eventually, after more than 1,000 years, Çatalhöyük was abandoned. Not conquered, as far as we can tell, just gradually left behind, which brings us a few thousand years later, and a few hundred miles away, to a very different kind of experiment, Uruk. By around 3200 BCE, in the river plains of southern Mesopotamia, Uruk had become something the world had essentially never seen before. Not a large village, not an overgrown honeycomb of household shrines, a genuine city, in the sense we'd still recognize the word today, with a population that may have reached tens of thousands of people. And Uruk solved the stranger problem completely differently than Çatalhöyük did. Instead of copying the same household pattern thousands of times, Uruk did something almost the opposite. It let people become different from each other, on purpose, and then built systems to stitch those differences back together. Think about what a city that size actually requires. Someone has to grow enough surplus food to feed people who aren't farming at all. Someone has to organize water for irrigation, because in this landscape, farming without managed canals simply doesn't work at that scale. Someone has to store grain safely enough that thousands of households can trust the supply won't just vanish. Someone has to make tools. Someone has to conduct religious ceremonies. Someone has to keep track of who contributed what and who's owed what in return. No single household could plausibly handle all of that alone anymore. The city's real invention wasn't a bigger wall, it was specialization. And specialization creates a very specific new problem: dependency on strangers. The potter needs the farmer's grain, the farmer needs the toolmaker's tools, the priest needs everyone's offerings, and everyone, in turn, wants the priest to keep the gods cooperative about the harvest. In a small kin-based band, you'd handle all of that through direct personal relationships. In a city of tens of thousands, you physically cannot maintain a personal relationship with everyone your life now depends on. So Uruk built something to stand in for personal trust: institutions. This is where writing enters the story, and not as poetry. Some of the very earliest written tablets from Uruk aren't myths or prayers, they're receipts. Grain deliveries, labor assignments, rations, livestock counts. Civilization apparently invented spreadsheets before it invented literature. And that's not a joke, it's the whole point. A city of strangers cannot run on memory and reputation the way a village of 40 people can. It needs a record that doesn't depend on any one person remembering anything correctly, or honestly. Temples became something close to the city's operating system. Uruk's Eanna precinct, a sprawling complex of temples and courtyards dedicated to the goddess Inanna, coordinated grain storage, organized labor for big communal projects, mediated the exchange of goods, and gave everyone a single, shared, physical place to belong to, even if they'd never met most of the other people who belonged there too. You didn't need to personally know your neighbor to trust the temple's grain reserves, or the temple's accounting, or the temple's festival calendar. The institution absorbed the trust that used to live only between people who actually knew each other. Archaeologists have even found the small, unglamorous proof of this in bowls, thousands of them, mass-produced, roughly identical, standardized ration bowls handed out to workers as payment for labor on temple projects. It's not romantic, it's payroll, but it's exactly the kind of invention a city of strangers needs and a village of 40 relatives never would. A way to pay someone you don't personally know, fairly, consistently, and at scale, without every transaction turning into a negotiation. Walls did something similar, in a much blunter way. A city wall is a strange object if you think about it for more than 5 seconds, because it doesn't just keep enemies out, it also draws an enormous circle around a huge crowd of total strangers and says, functionally, everyone inside this line is now us. You didn't choose your 10,000 new neighbors. The wall chose them for you. Markets did a third version of the same trick. A market is, structurally, an agreement to cooperate with a stranger for exactly as long as the transaction takes, and not 1 second longer. You don't need to trust the potter's character. You need to trust that the exchange itself, so much grain for so much pottery, will be honored, because the whole marketplace is watching, and the whole marketplace depends on trades actually working. That is an entirely different kind of trust than, I trust you because I've known your family for 30 years. It's trust in a system, not trust in a person, and it scales in a way personal trust never could. None of this means city life was some peaceful utopia of cooperative strangers holding hands. Dense populations packed together for the first time also discovered problems small bands rarely had to face at the same scale. Disease could spread faster through crowded, permanent settlements than through small, mobile ones, especially once people were living alongside penned livestock and shared water sources instead of moving on before waste and infection had time to build up. Waste and water management became constant, unglamorous, life-or-death engineering problems, and a surprising amount of early city administration, in Uruk and elsewhere, was really just an ongoing argument about drains, canals, and who was responsible for keeping them clear. Inequality, which existed in smaller societies too, became far more visible and far more entrenched once some households controlled granaries, workshops, or official positions that others simply didn't have access to. In a village of 40 people, everyone can see roughly what everyone else has. In a city of 30,000, wealth can quietly concentrate in a temple precinct or a merchant family for generations before most residents ever fully register how lopsided things have become. And when personal reputation stops being the main thing keeping people in line, someone eventually has to invent formal punishment for the people who figure out they can misbehave anonymously in a crowd. Cities didn't just invent cooperation, they invented crime, in the specific modern sense of an offense against strangers who don't know you well enough to just talk it out around a fire. And they invented the awkward, unglamorous machinery of judges, witnesses, and written testimony needed to settle a dispute between two people who have never met before and, frankly, might be lying. Look at what Uruk actually needed to function, and you start to see a checklist that every city since has quietly copied. A shared boundary, so a crowd of strangers can agree on who counts as in. A shared storage and distribution system, so people can trust there will be food tomorrow without personally knowing the farmer who grew it. A shared record-keeping system, so obligations between strangers can be tracked without relying on memory or reputation. A shared marketplace, so goods can move between people who will never be friends. A shared religious or civic center, so an enormous crowd of individuals has one thing they can all point to and call theirs. And eventually, a shared system of law and punishment, because someone, somewhere, was always going to test what a crowd of strangers can get away with. There's a small, telling object that shows up around this same time, the cylinder seal, a little carved stone rolled across wet clay to leave a unique personal mark. On the surface it looks like a signature. What it actually represents is bigger than that. It's proof, physical and checkable, that a specific stranger really did authorize a specific transaction, in a city too large for anyone to simply take another stranger's word for it anymore. Put a king on top of all that later, and sure, you eventually get a kingdom, and thrones, and dynasties, and everything that comes with them. But the king was never the hard part, and honestly, he shows up relatively late to this story. The hard part, the actual prehistoric engineering marvel, was getting thousands of people who owe each other nothing personally to show up, cooperate, trade fairly, share water, bury their dead with some kind of shared meaning, and mostly not kill each other, for generation after generation. Solve that problem first, and eventually somebody is always going to volunteer to sit at the top of it. Fail to solve it, and no throne in the world will hold a city together anyway. That's really what separates Çatalhöyük's Honeycomb from Uruk's sprawling Metropolis. Çatalhöyük proved you could pack strangers together using a kind of camouflage, make everyone's household look and behave enough like everyone else's that difference barely registered. Uruk proves something almost opposite and, in the long run, far more powerful, that strangers could stay completely different from each other, a farmer, a priest, a potter, a soldier, a scribe, and still function as one enormous we, as long as something bigger than personal relationships was holding the seams together. We still live entirely inside that second experiment. Every city on Earth today is fundamentally a machine for getting strangers to cooperate, using institutions instead of kinship, records instead of memory, markets instead of favors, and laws instead of gossip and shame. You don't know the people who grew your food, built your home, treated your water, or wired your electricity, and you trust all of it anyway, because somewhere back at the beginning, a handful of ancient settlements ran the experiment first and figured out, slowly, painfully, and permanently, that strangers actually could learn to live like neighbors. Every time you use a crosswalk and trust the stranger behind the wheel to stop, or drop cash on a counter and trust a stranger you'll never see again to hand over the right change, you are quietly running a 9,000-year-old experiment that started with people building rooftop ladders into a honeycomb of houses in Anatolia and grew, a few thousand years later into a river-plain metropolis of scribes, priests, potters, and ration bowls in southern Mesopotamia. So the next time you're standing in a crowd of people you will never know, on a street none of you built alone, remember what's actually holding that crowd together. Not friendship, not family, an idea, older than any king, that a stranger can be trusted enough to build a life next to. That idea is the actual city. Everything built on top of it, the walls, the temples, the thrones, came later.